Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. I want to be very respectful of your time. I know it's a weeknight and you have work or school tomorrow, so I'll start on time and hopefully end on time. If it gets too long or too boring, there's the doors. But I'd like to begin with this prayer, which is taken from the ritual of a dedication of the church. This is the preface, which is that part of the Mass just before it's part of the Eucharistic prayer. It's when the priest says, "The Lord be with you, lift up your heart." So it's that part of the Eucharistic prayer during which we're still standing. And it's exquisite in its text and in its imagery. So I just want to use that as our opening prayer because I think it sets a good pattern and tone for what we're about this evening. So would you stand? In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Let us pray. Father most holy, you have made the whole world a temple of your glory, that your name might everywhere be extolled. Yet you allow us to consecrate to you apt places for the divine mysteries. And so we dedicate joyfully to your majesty this house of prayer built by human labor. Here is foreshadowed the mystery of the true temple. Here is prefigured the heavenly Jerusalem. For you made the body of your Son, born of the tender Virgin, the temple consecrated to you, in which the fullness of the Godhead might dwell. You also established the church as a holy city, built upon the foundation of the apostles, with Christ Jesus himself as the chief cornerstone, a city to be built of chosen stones, given life by the Spirit and bonded by charity, where for endless ages you will be all in all, and the light of Christ will shine undimmed forever. We pray in his name, now and forever. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So as you've been aware, I've talked about this and written several articles in the bulletin that for our centennial in 3 years, I'd like to have a sense of renewal in both space and spirit. And the space refers, of course, to this place of worship. And in the very process of renewing this space, there will be a spiritual renewal, but also within other aspects of our parish formation, we hope to offer other opportunities for spiritual renewal as well. So I hope that this evening's presentation, the first of two, would lay a foundation for what we want to do or what we might do. I'm saying that we want to repair and enhance. There are obviously aspects of our church that need some work to be repaired. And at the same time, we might consider aspects that need to be enhanced. How can we make it more beautiful? So before we start doing that, I think it's always good to have a foundation from which we make these decisions, so that the decisions are informed and they're not just whimsical according to some persons or persons' preferences. And we all know we have different tastes and styles, which is fine. And we hope that any of the decisions we make will grow out of what we have as a good understanding, a theological understanding of sacred space as Catholic Christians. But to get even there, let's go back to our most primal moments. What do human beings, or what have human beings done with space since time began? So our next slide reminds us that spaces, they're not all equal. You know, we do have different places where we live and work and play and vacation. And so we have a hierarchy. We understand that what happens in one place isn't necessarily what has to happen in another. not just because it can't, but also because it perhaps shouldn't. So our next slide tells us some options that people have used or designated as sacred. What are they? Well, they're places that tend to be loved, tend to be places that are feared, places that have taken a hold of our imagination, that linger in the memory, that lodge in the soul. They're places where life or death have touched a person or a people. They're places where power is felt, where healing might happen. The anthropological term for all of that is the numinous, where something very mysterious and awesome is experienced. And that doesn't happen in all places. So where that is something that touches the human spirit or soul, we designate those as sacred. Now, the other places that we have are profane, like that old garbage dump. They're boring places. They don't touch our imagination, at least in a positive way. They tend to be mundane. They're places that we want to forget about. They're places that we don't associate with other aspects of humanity or life. They don't touch our souls or imagination. They don't leave a lasting imprint or impact, and we don't care to go back to them. Next. So let's go back to sacred places. There are, I think, two kinds. There are places that are discovered. These are natural areas of the world where power is experienced, and those are just some examples. Canyons, the Grand Canyon. I've never been there, but people who have say they feel a very powerful sense of God there. Sacred wells, flowing water, frequently healings happen there. Groves, forests. This is very common in places of Ireland. The Celtic people, which is one of the reasons I love that culture so much, have always had a rich appreciation for the mystical, and that the whole transcendent, whether it was pre-Christian or after Christian, was something where God could be felt, where divinity, whether it was a goddess or God or whatever, and they marked those aside in some special way. I have told this story before, but I love to tell it. When I went to Ireland one time, I was in a grocery store in a little village of Connemara, and I remember going up to the woman, like, you know, the typical dumb tourist, and I said, "Oh, do you all still believe in the leprechauns and the little people and all the angels and the demons and all that stuff?" And she said, "Nobody believes in that rubbish anymore. But they still exist." See, that's lodged into their psychic, into their religious imagination. It's part of their DNA. So those are places in nature that get discovered and that somehow get marked or set apart. The other type of sacred places are ones that we designate because we want something powerful to happen there. Cathedrals, monasteries, shrines. We mark those aside because we believe that God will be faithful and abide with us in these places that we construct out of the work of the earth. So discovered places, designated places. And in both instances, to mark them or to create them, there's usually some kind of a ritual that I'll mention a little bit about later. So, Christians, church buildings, do we need them? I think in an absolute sense, we don't, because unlike other traditions, Judaism, for example, Christianity's never been tied to a specific place or to a specific land. I mean, we talk about the Holy Land, the sacred places where the mysteries of Jesus' life occurred, but the whole world, can embrace Christianity without reference to the Holy Land, whereas in Judaism and Islam there were the mosques and the temple. Christianity survived and at times even flourished when they weren't allowed to have churches, when there was persecution and poverty. The first 300 years of our faith, for example, when Christianity was illegal, it flourished. Christianity always seems to flourish during times of persecution. It always flourishes when there's something at risk. So when we see people not coming to church or participating in church activities, we wonder, maybe there's not enough risk. Ireland, again, another reference, during those, what they call the penal years, when England forbade the practice of Catholicism and they weren't allowed to gather in their churches, the religion flourished. They would gather outside in what they called mass rocks, places where nobody else knew about except the Irish, or the Catholic Irish, and there was usually a rock upon which they would offer the sacrifice of the Mass. When I was in Ireland, I visited a monastery, Glenstall, Benedictine, and they had on their property a place that they believed was a mass rock, which during the time of persecution, Catholics would have gathered to celebrate the mysteries. There was also a beautiful group of singers up in Wisconsin called Willow Green, and they were giving a concert. These were not necessarily Christians, but they were giving a concert with the Irish harp and the instrument, and the woman said, "I'm not a Catholic, but I love this song, and I'll tell you why." And she played it, and she sang it, and it was called one of the hidden songs. Because during the times of persecution, they had these gatherings that were in secret, and there was a collection of songs that were in some way coded, hidden. And one of them was about an incident at a mass rock where the authorities came and arrested the people and collected the vessels and the books that were used. The priest was arrested and put in prison. And from his prison cell, he sang the song that she sang. And the refrain was, "Have you seen my sweetheart?" Now that's an odd thing for a priest to be singing about, isn't it? "Have you seen my sweetheart?" That was a code for the word chalice. In other words, did somebody get the chalice? When they came and broke up our gathering, those things should have been preserved. Who has them? And that was his concern as he sat incarcerated. Who has my sweetheart? So we've always had a sense that certain things in certain places are designated to have a certain power. Germany, another example during the concentration camp times, gathered and celebrated Mass. There were no special churches there, but the intensity and the power of their religious experience, nobody at all would ever question. So those became sacred places. So I think we can say that from the earliest times, Christians, although they didn't need public buildings as other religions did, nonetheless adapted buildings for worship. One, because it was convenient, and you could tell people where to gather, and they had little symbols like the fish that would point or direct people to the gathering. But more importantly, there was a theological reason why they wanted to set these places aside. Because at the heart of our faith, we believe God came to dwell among us. That's what the prologue in the Gospel of John tells us. The Word became flesh and pitched his tent literally the Greek, pitched his tent among us. So with the divine presence permeating all facets of life, personal, domestic, social, political, Christians felt the need to translate that conviction into buildings, brick and mortar. So these buildings became a sign of our redemption. Now, what laid the foundation for all of that? I keep going back farther. We go back to the first book of the Bible, where we're told that God created, and there are two creation stories, but both of them give a very positive understanding of what God did, the work of his hands. So God looked at everything he had made, and he found it very good. I think that's the first principle, that the world is holy, and that God sanctified it because it was the work of his hands, and therefore everything in the world is something that can be incorporated into worship. Since God gave it to us, now we use what God gave us to respond in praise and thanksgiving. That means we use water and oil and fire and bread and wine and buildings. Revelation. Going farther into the book of Genesis, there are some great stories with the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Jacob has some fascinating moments during his sleep. One of those, my favorite, is where he's, because of what he did, duped his brother. He had to flee and now is preparing the next day to meet him. And he doesn't know how his brother Esau is going to respond to him, so he separates his family. He spends the night alone, and in the middle of the night, somebody comes to wrestle with him. Sometimes that's depicted as an angel, but eventually he understands that as God. And God breaks his hip. And forever he is limping around because he's encountered divinity. And he says that. I have contended with God and have lived. And then God changes his name to Israel, which means one who wrestles with God. The other great story with Jacob is, again, he's traveling at night, and he stops to rest, and he takes this rock and uses it as his pillow. And during the night, he has this dream of angels ascending and descending. So these heavenly mystical creatures, messengers, are going up and down from heaven to earth like a ladder, connecting these two realities. And we use that story, that reading, on the Feast of the Guardian Angels. But in the morning he wakes up and he says, how awesome is this place? This is nothing else but the house of God, the gateway of heaven. And I didn't know it, he said. So moved as he was with that experience, he takes the rock that was his pillow and he sets it up as a marker stone, and he consecrates it by pouring oil on it. Because oil was something used to designate kings, prophets, and places. And it's still an element that we use in the designation of altars and churches, priests, people at confirmation, children at baptism. Revelation. Then Israel needs to experience a moment of salvation, because they're flourishing now as a people, and threatened by that, the Egyptians, of course, oppress them, and God comes down to liberate Israel. And to do that, he uses Moses, who has this experience of the burning bush. He sees the bush, he goes closer to it, because this is a phenomenon that's not heard of, that something would burn and not be consumed. And a voice comes from the bush and says, remove your sandals, because the place where you're standing is holy ground. Now, there's a great story in the Talmud, the Jewish commentary on the scriptures, where the rabbi is teaching this account, and one of the students challenges him, well, Rabbi, if it's true that the whole world is holy, that everything is good because it came from God, why should Moses have had to remove his shoes? Because he's told this is sacred ground. Isn't all ground holy? Good question. The rabbi responds, of course the whole world is holy. All ground is holy. However, we tend to forget that until we designate places to remove our sandals and to acknowledge the holiness. I think there's a good theology for why we build churches. Because we do believe that the whole world is holy. But it's easy to forget that. I would call that naive incarnationalism. You know, we believe that God is incarnate and grace permeates it. But let's not be too naive. Because sin is still a part of our world. We're still broken. And we can easily forget that the world is holy. And so these places we create are perpetual reminders. Not just that this is holy, but out there is holy too. So when we take off our shoes, metaphorically speaking, and recognize divinity, then we're prepared to recognize the divinity everywhere. So now Israel has been freed. They're journeying in the desert. They've experienced the presence of Yahweh and have built vessels, places that can enclose and encase their sacred objects, like the commandment, the tablets, the rod of Aaron. And they encase all of that, as we know, in this ark. Important to remember, the ark is mobile, so it can move. And then they put it in a tent of meeting. Again, the tent is temporary. It's not a permanent structure. And in an experience of consecrating that tent, in Exodus 40, it says a cloud covered it. And the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Now there's a great symbol in all of that. Because the word in Hebrew for glory is kabod. And it means heaviness, gravitas. You know, we say that sometimes about people. Someone came in a room and their presence could be felt. You know, so there's a heaviness to things that are sacred and meaningful. And then that frequently got symbolized as a cloud. You see there. Cloud is the kabod, the glory of God. Now that word in Hebrew, kabod, gets translated into Greek with the word doxa that we use for glory. When we talk about the doxology in the Mass, the through him, with him, in him, all glory and honor is yours. So to appreciate that whole understanding of what is glory, we got to go back to those beautiful roots in our tradition from the Old Testament. That the glory of God filled this place, and it was felt, it was visible, and it left a lasting impact. But then something else happens. They get settled. They're not nomadic people anymore. David becomes king, and he's taken Israel to its greatest peak of military prowess, political achievement. He's built a gorgeous palace for himself. He has all of these wives and all of these servants, and says, you know, something's wrong here. I'm living in this house of gold, whereas the ark of God dwells in this tent. Something's wrong with this. So David decides he needs to build a very special place for this Ark of the Covenant. It's permanent, though. See, prior to this, the ark and the tent could be moved. And there's that image of mobility, that the ark goes where the people go, but there's also a sense, and Ezekiel the prophet will pick this up, is that God can move out if he's not happy. So God can bolt. So the prophet Nathan tells him, okay, go ahead, start the design of the temple. And then Nathan has an experience of God who says, why? All these years I've dwelt in a tent. I've never asked you for a building. It's not you who will build a house for me. I will build a house for you. A house meaning the nation. And so Nathan has to go back to David and says, God doesn't want this. Besides, as a warrior, you shed too much blood. There's too much blood on your hands. You're not entitled to build such a sacred place. So David never builds the temple. One of the reasons the people wanted a temple was so that they could look like the other religions. They wanted to be like the nations, because all the other pagan traditions had these places where they could gather and worship, and Israel thought, well, if they can have one, so can we. Plus, Israel conquered all of those nations, and so they felt we should do the same thing. So what starts to happen here is the faith of Israel gets contaminated by the tradition of the other peoples. And that's probably why the prophets said God didn't want it. There's another interesting reason why some scripture scholars think that God didn't want a temple. Because when you read the story of how it was constructed and what it was constructed of, it was very precious material. Gold, Lebanon, cedars of Lebanon. All of these precious things that had to be brought in from other nations by slaves at the expense of the poor. So there was a sense of social justice. The temple, as they had envisioned it, was not going to be something that was available for everyone. It was going to be a dynastic chapel, really, the king's chapel, and it would be built at the expense of the poor. Nonetheless, the people moaned and cried, and we want our temple. So eventually God gives in, but Solomon builds it. And it's a glorious edifice. They say in the ancient world, it was the second most magnificent building. The first was the Temple of Karnak in Egypt. So there's this huge building. Could you go back? Permanence. There was this huge building with all of these various sections that you had to, there was a gradation that you had to be admitted to. The outermost part was the court of the Gentiles. They could go in, non-Jews, the uncircumcised. And then as you got closer to this, the Holy of Holies, fewer and fewer people had access. And then within that, there was the most sacred place where the Ark of the Covenant was. So what we start seeing here is a hierarchy. The place isn't universal to everybody. Special people had access to it, but not everyone. Nonetheless, they loved their temple. Unfortunately, in 587, the Babylonians took captivity of Israel and sent many of the people into exile, the artisans, the scholars. And with the destruction of the temple, there was something that was devastating to the spiritual psyche of the Israelites. This temple was a permanent sign that God was in their midst. It was thought to be indestructible, and yet it got destroyed. So now they have to rethink their theology. Did God leave us? Did we do something that warranted this attack, this destruction? And it was a horrible dilemma they wrestled with all during their time of captivity, when in Babylon, and we hear this in Psalm 137, they sang, "By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat weeping, remembering Zion." That's Jerusalem. "On the poplars that grew there, we hung up our harps." The harp was the instrument that was used for worship. And they went on to say in this psalm, "Our captors said to us, 'Sing the songs of Zion.' And we said, 'No.' How could we? How could we sing the songs of Zion in an alien land? It just wasn't right." And they say, "If I forget you, Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Let my tongue cleave to my palate, if I would dare to sing these songs." See, the right hand is what was used to pluck the harp. So they sat in exile for a number of years, and then finally the Persian King Cyrus let them go back, and they rebuilt their temple. And they had this grand rededication. And once again, they found themselves galvanized because they had this physical, tangible, concrete place that gave them their identity, that connected them with God, and reminded them of God's fidelity. Now, around 200 years before Jesus, they'll once again, the people of Israel, be held hostage by the Greeks. The King Antiochus Epiphanes, he wants to make everybody in that world Greek, so he forbade the use of Hebrew, any of the Jewish practices. He took the vessels of the temple, and this is what was so fascinating. His name, Epiphanes, means manifestation of God. He had this enormous ego. And he erected in the temple a statue of himself. And this was the most outrageous thing that could happen because it violated the first commandment. He created an idol of himself and put it in their place of worship. And they called that idol the Abomination of Desolation. And then we hear the story of the Maccabees, who gathered and rallied their forces and troops, conquered the Greeks, and restored their temple in a great celebration that we now remember as Hanukkah. Can you see the menorah? Now we come to the New Testament. We know that Jesus went to the temple. We also know at the time of Jesus there were synagogues. Those were not places where ritual sacrifices were conducted. They were places of learning and study and the proclamation of the law. So there was still the one temple in Jerusalem that people would go to for the high holy days. And yet we hear Jesus predicting things throughout the text. You know, that stories where he overturns the table and chases out the money changers and says that he's going to destroy this temple and in 3 days rebuild it. Whatever he meant by that, the evangelists interpreted that as meaning the temple of his body. Eventually, his prediction comes true because in 70 AD, the Romans will destroy that temple and it has never been rebuilt. All you have now is that wall on the north side that's referred to as the Wailing Wall, where people go and pray. And there is a sect of Jewish people who do want to have that temple rebuilt and reinaugurate the sacrifices, the cultic practices that went there. I don't know about you, but I have no desire to see a bull slashed and bled and sprinkled with blood, which is what those sacrifices would entail. But because there was no place anymore a temple, they had to, like the Israelites, do some rethinking and redefining. And that's what they do. They spiritualize. Because there isn't a concrete place, it goes to the level of the interior, the spiritual. And so we hear in the letter to the Hebrews, which was probably written after the destruction of the temple, but when Christ came as high priest of the good things that have to be passing from the greater to the more perfect tabernacle, not made by hands, that is belonging not to this creation, he entered once and for all into the sanctuary, not with blood of goats and calves, but with his own blood, thus obtaining redemption. So you see what's happening? There's no physical place, so it's now Christ in his own body who becomes the everlasting sign of God's presence in their midst. He's the new temple. And we hear in that first letter of Peter, come to him a living stone, Christ, living stone, rejected by human beings, but precious in the sight of God. So a lot of that imagery we hear during the Easter season, when we celebrate the resurrection of Christ after he experienced the rejection and crucifixion. But as I say, it took on this very spiritual tone because there wasn't anything physical that they were allowed to have. So what did the early Christians do? Well, for the first 300 years of its existence, our faith was illegal. It was not a recognized religion in the Roman Empire, like Judaism was, or some of the other pagan cults. So they weren't allowed to have any public gathering places. And persecution happened in places, sporadically. It was not 300 years of bloodshed, but in certain places, Rome, North Africa, the bloodshed and the persecution could be quite severe. So there isn't a lot of ceremony or ritual or public buildings. Where they would gather are what was called the house churches. And this is excavated. This is a real house church in a part of Syria, and it's called the house church of Dura, Europas. Interesting, a lot of these house churches were owned by wealthy women, like you. And they had a certain structure to them that they simply adapted from what was there in the home. So there was this atrium, this courtyard, but notice over here, that's a well, a bath. That's where baptism would happen. And at some place, they would have a table that would be used for the Eucharistic sacrifice. So that's what the early church did. It's kind of a romantic notion when people say, oh, they would gather in the catacombs. Historians don't think that was that widespread. First of all, catacombs were cemeteries with rotting corpses. So it wouldn't have been a very pleasant place to come together. They may have gathered there on the anniversary of a martyr, but for the most part, people gathered in homes. And their numbers were very small, maybe 20, 30, whatever. But then something happens in 313. The Emperor Constantine, whose mother was St. Helena, she was a Christian, and she prayed for his conversion. And he had this vision that if he would paint the cross on the shields of his warriors on the night before a battle, they would be victorious, and they were. So out of gratitude for the victory that he attributed to the Christian God, he legalized Christianity. 313. It's sometimes called the Edict of Milan or the Edict of Constantine, but that was a huge watershed moment in the history of our faith. Remember when I said when Christians are persecuted, they thrive? Well, some compromises got made when they became legal because they got pulled into the civic structures, and they couldn't be as countercultural as perhaps they would have liked. Nonetheless, the emperor was very good to them and allowed them certain privileges. So much of the ritual that we do still to this day in the Mass is because Constantine allowed it to happen. Processions, vestments, clothing, incense, a processional cross, all of those were imperial ritual things that the Christians adapted. And his great gift to them were buildings. And you see an example of one here. These are called basilicas, and that's the floor plan. Now, it would have been elongated the other way, but what's significant is he doesn't give them the pagan temples. Paganism is allowed for a few more years, but by 380, the Emperor Theodosius outlaws pagans and makes Christianity the state religion. But they had these buildings that were civic gathering places, courtrooms, where litigation happened. So you see in this apse-like area, that's where the emperor would sit, or the judge, and he would be flanked by his advisors, lawyers. And then all of the people would come in to receive some kind of adjudication, some rendering. So when the Christians were given these buildings, they kept the shape and adapted them for their own use. They always had this atrium, this outer courtyard, and perhaps the baptisms could be done there. At this time, baptisms were done privately because they were done in the in the nude. So for the sake of modesty, they were either in separate places or in places that were, shielded and covered. But then you had this huge nave here and all of these aisles. No seating, so it made for a really good processional space. And then you had this bema, this platform that you would ascend, and in this apse area there you'd see the Pope or the bishop, and there the altar. That's still a style that we see in many churches today. We'll see a few examples of that shortly. But that comes from basilica, and the word basilica means kingdom. So these basilicas that the Christians took over were understood to be like an antechamber to the kingdom of God. And they made full use of that space with lots of movement and ceremony and ritual that now they're allowed to do, but weren't before. Something new happens. Because they're legal, they have the luxury to study, to debate, to ask questions, particularly about the divinity of Jesus. See, when you're persecuted, you're just worried about surviving. You're not thinking about writing theses and treatises and explanations of a theological nature. Once they're allowed to do that, well, they start asking questions. Who is Jesus? Is he God? Is he human? Is he both? How much? When? When did he become human? How long was he God? So all those questions surface, and they're debated, and they become a collection called the Christological controversies. And the church had to make decisions about, say, the divinity and the humanity of Jesus. Jesus is fully human, fully divine, and that's where we get the creeds that we say in the Mass. The Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed that we say on Sunday. Hear those phrases. God from God, light from light, true God from true God. So those are all statements to show that Jesus had a pre-existent Christos, that he was equal to God. Now their understanding was only God could bring salvation. And so if Jesus is both human and divine, that's okay. But we still want to emphasize the divinity, they believe, because a human mortal cannot bring salvation. Only God can do that. So even though everybody who was Orthodox believed that Jesus was both God and human, the emphasis went on to the divinity. Because if we weren't saved, and only God can save, if we weren't saved, well, horrible things will happen to us. The crops won't grow, the barbarians will invade, we'll come down with pandemics. So all of that was very important in their understanding, in their worldview. So more and more, we're going to find this emphasis on the transcendence of Christ, his remoteness. In those first 300 years, Jesus was more often than not portrayed as a shepherd, with the sheep on his shoulders. Now, Jesus is going to be portrayed as the Pantocrator, the icon, the remote, the distant. And as that happens, as the transcendence of Jesus and God gets emphasized, and the priest is the one who connects these things, the people will very naturally start pulling back. Not from religion, not from church, but there's going to be a personal sense of unworthiness that develops in their religious imaginations. So from here on in, 4th, 5th century on, we're going to see a greater distance between the altar and the assembly. In places, we're going to see barriers go up. Eventually, because of a desire to face east, the priest's back will be to the assembly frequently. Then the altar is going to get pushed farther away, attached to the wall with a great deal of ornamentation around it. See, that's all happening because of this theological concern. And what's going to happen now in the devotional life of the people is the need for intercessors. So here's where we're going to find the devotion to Mary becoming very important. The cult of the saints, the cult of relics. All of these mediators that connect people to God because they consider themselves unworthy of approaching the divine majesty. Now, they didn't stop believing, but they're going to just pull back, even to the point of not receiving communion. So the oldest practice of communion was always in the hand. Then some would take it by means of the tongue, and then they're just not going to take it all together. Now, this doesn't happen overnight. This is over centuries, to the point where one of the councils is going to say, you've got to go to communion at least once a year. And while they're not receiving the Eucharistic food, they still believe in the real presence, and they still believe in the miracle of the consecration. And that's when we're going to start seeing a lot of devotional practices that emphasize that moment in the Mass. So previously, the whole Eucharistic prayer was seen as sacred. No one part of it was more important than the other. But because of this emphasis on the change of the bread and the wine into the body and blood of Christ, we're going to have things like the bells. Why? Because the people didn't understand the language anymore. They didn't understand Latin. So they're not going to know when the miracle happens. That's why the bells were brought in, to tell them to look up. That came to be called ocular worship, because they weren't receiving the Eucharistic bread as food, but they wanted to look and see. And then in the 13th century, that need will get enshrined in other practices, Eucharistic devotions like adoration, the Blessed Sacrament, processions. So I want to emphasize here that they don't deny the real presence of Christ in the consecrated elements. They don't feel worthy enough to receive them. They do want to look at them. And they're going to design their churches in such a way that encourages that ability to look, to see. So the architecture of churches, as we'll see in a few moments, will have these along those naves, or those aisles, I should say, windows, so that if you were riding on a horse, you could look in and see the consecration. And the external bells of the city, the village, would signal when that was going to happen. I mean, they believed that this was the most powerful thing that could happen. So you could be on a horse, you could run around from church to church in the course of a morning and experience this mystical moment. But it was all very ocular. Next slide, let's move into. So that's going on in the Roman rite, the liturgy as it was celebrated in Rome, and then carried through missionaries to other parts of the world. There's also a style that was unique in Constantinople, or Byzantium became Constantinople. Today we call it Istanbul. And the greatest example of religious architecture from this period is this building called the Hagia Sophia. That's the floor plan. Now this was built by the Emperor Justinian in 537, in Constantinople, which was now the center of the Roman Empire. And it was just this magnificent place known for this glorious dome. I have never seen it. People who have say it's an experience like nothing else, because they designed this thing with new styles of engineering whereby you feel like you're floating, all this light around. And you can see, maybe not too well, but all these things are doorways, because the procession would move around the city, and then the people would come through these doors and come into this magnificent piece of liturgical splendor and be under the dome. But it was very much, the altar in the center. So it's Christ in the midst of the assembled people who are gathering around. And it was a beautiful, almost like a liturgical marketplace, milling about, chants and ceremonies going on. And what they start to have to do is put certain barriers up for crowd control. There are stories, we have them documented from that period, where the deacon is carrying the gospel book and these little kids are chasing after him. So they start putting, as they say, these barriers to help regulate and keep the traffic organized. And then in the Eastern Church, which is where this is happening, those barriers are going to go up higher and higher and higher, and eventually be called the iconostas. And on them are going to be placed various icons. But initially, the liturgy as it was celebrated in this eastern part of the empire was very communal and very celebratory, without the sense of exclusion. But as things happen and things evolve, things change. Now, at one point, I can't remember when, the Turks captured the building, and they put up these stupid minarets. This place is full of mosaics that thankfully they left. Mosaics of Christ, the Virgin Mary. But then they put in these shields with Islamic statements. And then it was turned into a museum. And then I think it was last year, the government gave it back as a mosque, which just caused this huge outrage among Christians, including the Pope. So it's very controversial. But thankfully, architecturally, it's still there. They didn't destroy it, and it's just a splendid example of what people did because of their faith. Back to the Roman Empire. So from the house churches we move to the basilicas. The next style is this Romanesque. Now you recognize that. That's the Leaning Tower of Pisa. This is the cathedral there. And you see the very long nave, the long aisles. That's what's characteristic of Romanesque, as well as these arches, round arches. And that's a bell tower. And then you can't see it too well, but there's a baptistry, which is a magnificent building. If you've ever gone there, you'll see it's filled with beautiful mosaics and this stunning font where people were reborn through baptism. And then we moved into like 12th, 13th century to Gothic with a unique style. Because the Romanesque was very solid. It had the appearance of a fortress. It was a statement that Christianity is here to stay. And the church is this bastion that people come into and are protected. Gothic took that a step further and wanted to make this fortress-like place another image of heaven. And the engineering styles that emerged at this time were just phenomenal. That's where you get the flying buttresses. This is Notre Dame in Paris that burned several years ago that hopefully will be repaired. But the idea was to keep it very light and high and filled with color. So stained glass windows, rose windows. And the fact that they could make these huge walls so high and support them without columns or a lot of interior structures is another architectural feat that this whole period in history will always be regarded for. So, Gothic. The next is the Renaissance. You know, Renaissance means the rebirth. Gothic was very sacred, well, but they're all sacred, but a great sense of the heaven, the otherworldly. The Renaissance wanted to recapture some of the things from the so-called pagan art. So that's where you start seeing these fat little cherubs, you know, and all of these styles that were common in Rome that now got adapted into Christianity. And probably the most perfect example of Renaissance and later Baroque art is St. Peter's, the Vatican. There's this facade with these columns which kind of hide the dome. Again, another magnificent thing. But in there you have that canopy by Bernini and that flood of light coming in. No pews, because people gathered. They didn't feel they needed to kneel. They put chairs in now for big gatherings, but it was just this splendid place. And directly, so that dome, right above there, goes down to the altar and goes down to the very bones of St. Peter. So this perfect access down to his tomb. So it's built over that. Baroque, it just kind of takes the Renaissance and it elaborates on it. Baroque art is very florid, very elaborate. It was, just to make it as flourishing and detailed as possible. The next is Rococo, which is kind of a extreme. It's detail that went wild on steroids. So if you ever see a Rococo church, it's got tons and tons of detail and design, and some monasteries in Switzerland are Rococo art. It's not a style that appeals to anybody because it can be sometimes labeled as very busy, but it was a product of its time. Then there was the desire to go back and reclaim some of the classical features, namely the columns. So they're going back to what was common in Rome and how we can continue to use those in the Christian church. So it's a new classical. See, frequently we'll see this. There's always a desire at some point to go back and reclaim. Go back and reclaim. We're seeing that right now. Then, 16th century. St. Peter's is being rebuilt. They're running out of money. So the Pope decides he's going to grant indulgences to people who will give a certain amount of money to rebuild St. Peter's. And that's a whole topic we don't even want to go into there. But that became a means of revenue. Then Martin Luther, who was an Augustinian friar, objected on scriptural grounds and with good reason. And then the whole Protestant Reformation emerged from that. And one of the things the Protestants emphasized that they believed Catholicism wasn't was the Word, the Scriptures. And Martin Luther, sola gratia, only grace saves. Indulgences don't. Sola gratia, sola scriptura, only the Bible is the Word of God. And so what you're going to see in these Protestant churches is a de-emphasis on the altar. I don't know if you can even see it back there. But a huge emphasis on the pulpit. They won't be receiving the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist, very often, maybe 4 times a year. Martin Luther wanted it more, but the people weren't ready for that. But preaching is going to be important in the vernacular with hymns and songs and all of the things that Catholicism at that time had jettisoned. So they're going to re-emphasize that. And it always happens that when the church felt threatened or criticized because of certain things it did, it hunkered down and emphasized them all the more. So while the Protestants are condemning a lot of the practices within the faith, the church is going to support them all the more. And it was that style that continued. Is there one after? What's the one after this? Okay, I guess I messed aside. You go back. One of the things that the Protestants criticized and even denied in some places was the Eucharistic presence of Jesus. And so some of the churches at this time are going to erect enormous tabernacles. Now, it wasn't until about the 11th century that we started seeing tabernacles in churches. Catholics always believed in the real presence, and the consecrated elements were always reserved somewhere, frequently in the sacristy, so that it could be used to give communion to the sick and the dying. And then in the 11th century, we start seeing tabernacles come into the sanctuary somewhere, but very inconspicuously. So they might be in a niche in the wall, they might be in a tower, a column. Sometimes the consecrated bread was placed in a dove that was suspended. So we don't have huge tabernacles going up into churches because the focus was what was happening on the Eucharistic table in the context of the Mass. After the Protestant Reformation, however, in order to kind of contradict the Protestants, we're going to have enormous tabernacles. The perfect example of that is the Jesuit church in Rome, the Church of the Gesù. So if you ever go there, you'll see the whole church is a throne room for the tabernacle. And that's when it becomes so central. So all these people who want to see tabernacles right in the center of the church, that's very late in the history of the church. That's just not something that was there for very long. Now we come to the modern period. This is an example of modern architecture. This is the Cathedral of the Lady of the Angels in Los Angeles. This was built maybe 20 years ago. It was controversial, but it was wedded to the environment, to the neighborhood, and it became a religious marketplace. So if you ever go there, I think it's spectacular. It's made of material that the other buildings would be made of. There's a fountain in there, there's a store, a gift store, there's a cafeteria, there's places where people can sit and have their lunch. So it's more than just an area for worship, it's where the church is intended to come together for all sorts of functions. There's a theater there. And they have this beautiful space with these tapestries of the saints that bring together the concept of the communion of saints, not far removed, but joining the people as they come together for worship. And, I mean, you can Google it and read all the other aspects about it, but it's quite stunning. I think it's probably the most traditional, in the richest sense of that word, going back to the heart, the tradition, and most modern church at the same time, if that makes any sense. You just have to go see it sometime. So what is there about modern churches? I just read an article, it's a kind of a synthesis of a book by a woman who was trying to explain why people, or understand why people don't like modern churches. And she said it's because of what's always going on in the culture. And keep this in mind too, the church never exists in a vacuum. Right? It's always influenced by what's going on in the wider circle of the world. So just as, this personal sense of unworthiness within individuals was flourishing, it affected how the architecture of the church came to be established. Well, she says in this modern era, we're talking now post-Vatican II, that there were two universal convictions in the world. And those convictions were these, that evolution and adaptation are integral to life. That's something new. Because the classical understanding was there are certain things that are immutable, that don't change. And what imaged that mentality were those strong Greek columns that eventually became Roman. That these are fortress-like realities, and they don't evolve. She's saying that in contemporary understanding, we see evolution. And that makes sense because when did evolution start getting taught with Darwin and those theories? Whether or not you believe in it, it was something that was promoted and that had an influence on people, which then influenced their understanding and their faith. So evolution is something that happens, evolves, and people have to adapt. Now she says that Catholicism responded in two different ways to that universal conviction. One was that we will be the one reality that doesn't change. So if everything out there is changing and evolving, we will show a certain timelessness. That's one response. The other is that, well, we may not change our belief in God. That's the one immutable thing. But we have to move forward into the future because that's where life is taking us. And we're following a living God. Now again, you don't have to agree with it, but she maintains that these were the two major responses which now influence how we design our churches. So we have those that want to keep a very classical design to show a certain timelessness, but many others that, for better or for worse, were designed to show this sense of evolution and moving forward. And she maintains that it's this conviction that produced some of the churches that people think are ugly. Because what they tried to do, if you have this understanding, is that your space has to be very adaptable. So you had no pews, you had chairs, so you could rearrange things. Or you put in screens so that you could show things changing all the time. Or you used materials that were eco-friendly. So all of those things that came with that understanding of evolution and adaptation impacted how churches came to look in our contemporary time. Now, as we know, frequently one extreme begets another. And that's what we see all throughout history. If the Catholic Church goes this way, as the Protestants thought were extreme, well, they're going to go to an extreme. They'll deny it all. So I think we're at a time where we're still in a state of flux, and maybe we always will be. Maybe that sense of evolution and adaptation is always going to be a hallmark of our faith. But we sense a tension within worshiping communities and among people about what is good art. What makes a church a beautiful church? And the one thing I would say before I go into this is that we all have our personal styles and preferences. And that's I think, as it should. I have a preference for Gregorian chant. I think it's the most perfect liturgical music. Nobody in this parish would want me to impose that. Would they, Jim? No, you like the hymns. You like the so-called upbeat music. So it's not a question of imposing a personal preference. We're all entitled to have those. I think what we have to avoid is this idea that only things that are old are good, or only things that are old are beautiful, or only things that are Gothic or Baroque are fitting for church architecture. Because the Vatican Council documents state very clearly that the church has never espoused just one style. It never has. And we can show that historically. Because if it does that, then what it's saying is that the Holy Spirit isn't active in this present culture and in this present time. And we believe that the Spirit does work among us, and that the grace of God flows into every era so that we can use our talents and our skills and the things that we have learned at this moment in history for the glory of God. I mean, that's why we have Gothic cathedrals, because the engineering feats that they developed now got brought into their churches. So if at that point in history they said only Romanesque, well, we wouldn't have Notre Dame. So I think we have to be real careful about saying that this is the only kind of architecture that can be used that's truly Catholic. The success of a church building or a renovation for the life of the community, I think, begins not with personal taste in art or architecture, but with these three questions. What model of church will the building employ? Now, by church here, I don't mean building, I mean understanding ecclesiology. What is our understanding of church at this time in history? You know, one of the titles or images that the Vatican documents reclaimed was the notion of the people of God. And there isn't one image for the church. If you read Avery Dulles' 5 models, they're all important. But at this time in history, what is the model? What does this style say? Well, this church was built in 1976. The Vatican reforms were understood and trying to be implemented, and there were extremes all over the place, because this church now doesn't look like it did back in 1976. Anybody remember the old one? Yeah? So this was lower, that wasn't there, carpet was all over, and it was a time when people thought, let's be avant-garde. So the main aisle wasn't on axis with the altar. It was like over here. And so it was just odd. And some claim that the architect was imitating the abbey. I don't know that that's accurate. There might have been some ideas. St. Procopius Abbey is, I think, a beautiful example of a modern church, whether you like it or not. Architecturally, it's won awards. It has a different theology. It's monastic, isn't it? It's more austere. The theme or the image within the church is light. And it wouldn't work as a parish church, probably. I think if it were being built today, it would look very different. But it's employing a certain understanding of church, monastic community. The second question, I think, if we're renovating or building, is what's our notion of full conscious and active participation? And how will the church facilitate that? You know, if you're in a medieval church with lots of screens and dividers and the choir here facing each other and the people way out there, that doesn't nurture full conscious active participation, which they weren't interested in fostering anyway, because they couldn't appreciate it, they didn't understand it. Theirs was a very visual theology. Father did up there, we did out here, and at some point it all got connected. But it wasn't what we're talking about today, if we're looking at those liturgical documents from the council, where people are meant to understand what the liturgy is about and to be able to participate fully in the vernacular. That doesn't mean we throw out all of our Latin hymns, but it just means that language is important. Martin Heidegger, the philosopher, language is the house of being. So we don't want people worshiping in a language they don't understand. As mystical and as beautiful as Latin can be, most of those people who like the Latin Mass like it as Vatican II Catholics. They didn't come from that culture. They didn't come from the pre-Vatican II culture. So they're looking at the Tridentine or the traditional Mass as contemporary people. And I don't think most of them know Latin either. And then lastly, where's the building going to fit into the neighborhood? Because that was important historically too. You know, churches were the center of the town, and people came there, and it wasn't just a place of worship, it was a place where litigations happened. The priest was one of the few people in the village that could speak, that understood language, it was literate. That's why they came to the church to get married, because he could sign the documents. And that's where weddings initially happened in the 11th century, and then eventually they came into the church. Prior to that, marriage wasn't even one of the 7 sacraments. So what is the role of the neighborhood? How does it impact the church? How will the church impact the neighborhood? You know, obviously there's only so much we can do with our building, unless we want to tear it down and build a new one. I don't think we do. But they're good questions to ponder. What is our understanding of church? And there probably isn't just one understanding, because the beauty of Joan of Arc is that it embraces a wide variety of people in terms of age and financial status and ethnic backgrounds, all of which make for a beautiful blending, which is what we say, at least I say, Jim Susik says, we take the blended approach here. A little bit of everything. If people ask, what is your style of liturgy like at Joan of Arc? I said, well, we're somewhere between Margaret Mary and Peter and Paul. And we are. And there's nothing wrong with that. So, keep that in mind. There are essentially, I think, when we look historically now, having said all that, 2 different plans, and they could be nuanced a little. the rectilinear plan, which is more characteristic of the medieval. You see, the rectangle. So there's heaven, the gates of heaven, and earth. See the hierarchy? Heaven, the gates, earth, God, the clergy, and the laity. So there's God, and the clergy are the ones who do the intercessing, the interceding, because that's what they did, and the laity were considered unworthy to approach God by themselves. So they needed intercessors. They needed Mary and the saints and the clergy to help bridge that gap. Or you can look at tabernacle, sanctuary, nave. So within the sanctuary is the tabernacle, in which is housed the Eucharistic presence, which is in the tabernacle, or in the sanctuary up here, and then the nave. So you see the sense of the hierarchy? Heaven, God, tabernacle. Gates, clergy, sanctuary. Earth, laity, nave. So that's one plan from which a church can be designed. The other is the centralized plan. And this isn't something new. The whole central plan was a design in ancient churches as well. Now, I'm not that good on graphics, but imagine circles around these. So the centralized plan says that God is in relation to all of his creation. It came from God. He's connected to it. And the clergy and the laity worship God together and become the sacrament of unity. It doesn't compromise God's transcendence, I don't think. In fact, I think it incorporates very beautifully our belief in both the transcendence and the immanence of God. So God is deeply connected with what he's created, and the priest and the people are united in an act of worship together. That doesn't mean we don't need clergy, and it doesn't mean we don't have different roles, because we do. And that's always going to be part of our religion, which is hierarchical by nature. But if that's the plan for a church, then it's going to be reflected in how it's built and designed. This would probably be better to say for next week. When I'd go into more detail, the principles, very specific about what the church needs. Just flash a few more slides, Jim, yeah. Next one. So we'll look at the church building, the congregations area, sanctuary area, altar. So what are the requirements now for how a church should look? Because they are specified, not rigidly so, but there are guidelines that were given to help keep the spirit of the Second Vatican Council, but also respectful of the tradition that we are heirs to. And we'll look at some of that next week. Hopefully, the artist and designer that we hired to help us in this process, Mr. Ken Brooks, will be able to be here. He's the owner of St. Paul Fabricating Company, the company that made our candlesticks and the ark and the cross. And they do beautiful work throughout the country. You can Google them, St. Paul Fabricating, and see the work that they do. And as far as I know, he intends to be here, and he'll do a better job explaining what he thinks we might do in terms of enhancement.